4 astronauts climbed into a capsule smaller than a mid-size apartment bedroom. They rode a rocket taller than the Statue of Liberty out past the edge of everything humanity had built, everything we had mapped, everything we considered safe. And what they found, or more precisely what found them, is something NASA's own scientists are still struggling to fully explain. This is not a story about triumph, not entirely. Artemis II was supposed to be the moment humanity reclaimed the moon, a symbolic return, a flex of civilizational muscle after 50 years of absence. The mission was choreographed, rehearsed, broadcast in high definition across every screen on Earth, and by most metrics it worked. But numbers don't capture what the crew encountered 370,000 kilometers from home. Data doesn't transmit the silence that fell over mission control during one particular window of the flight, and press releases, carefully worded, optimistically framed, don't tell you what the engineers said to each other after the cameras stopped rolling. What Artemis II actually revealed isn't just about the moon, it's about us, about the fragile thread by which we hang above an indifferent universe, about whether the future we're racing toward is one we're actually prepared to survive. If space fascinates you, a like and subscribe means everything to us. Let's begin. To understand what Artemis II revealed, we have to travel back, not just to the Apollo era, though we'll go there. We have to go back to the fundamental promise that underpinned the entire Artemis program, the belief, stated openly by NASA, by aerospace agencies around the world, by the most credentialed minds in spaceflight, that we were finally ready to return, ready to stay. The Artemis program launched officially in 2017 under NASA's mandate to return humans to the lunar surface by the mid-2020s. The stated goals were layered and ambitious: establish a sustained human presence on and around the moon, develop the Gateway, a lunar orbital space station, as a staging point, use the moon as a rehearsal ground for the eventual crewed mission to Mars, and critically, land the first woman and first person of color on the lunar surface. These weren't just scientific ambitions, they were civilizational ones. The hardware built to carry this vision was unlike anything constructed before. The Space Launch System, SLS, is the most powerful rocket ever flown. At 98 meters tall and generating 8.8 million pounds of thrust at launch, it eclipses even the Saturn V of the Apollo era in certain thrust parameters. The Orion capsule mounted atop it was engineered with decades of hard-won knowledge from Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and the Space Shuttle program baked into every system. Radiation shielding designed to withstand deep space exposure, life support systems built with quadruple redundancies, a heat shield tested against re-entry speeds and temperatures that would vaporize conventional materials. On paper, this was the most capable crewed vehicle in human history. So when Artemis I launched in November 2022, an uncrewed test flight, and completed its 25-day mission to lunar orbit and back flawlessly, the mood at NASA was euphoric. The heat shield performed, the capsule survived. The trajectory was perfect. Engineers who had spent entire careers building toward this moment allowed themselves something rare in aerospace culture: open celebration. Artemis II was next, and Artemis II would carry people. The crew announced in April 2023 was selected with deliberate historical weight. Commander Reed Wiseman, a US Navy test pilot and experienced astronaut. Pilot Victor Glover, a decorated Navy fighter pilot who had served aboard the International Space Station. Mission Specialist 1 Christina Koch, who held the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman in history. And Mission Specialist 2 Jeremy Hansen, a Canadian Space Agency astronaut, making him the first non-American to fly on a deep space mission since the Apollo-Soyuz test in 1975. 4 human beings, 4 names that would join Armstrong, Aldrin, Collins in the permanent ledger of those who went to the moon. What was Artemis II exactly? Unlike the later Artemis III mission, which is designed to land on the lunar surface, Artemis II was a crewed free-return trajectory flight. Think of it as a circumlunar loop. The spacecraft would ride SLS out of Earth orbit, swing around the far side of the moon at a closest approach of roughly 9,800 kilometers, use the moon's gravity to slingshot back toward Earth, and return. No landing, no rendezvous with Gateway. That infrastructure didn't yet exist. Just 4 people, 1 capsule, and the most inhospitable environment in the solar system. A shakedown cruise for the species. The maximum distance from Earth achieved during Artemis II was projected at approximately 370,000 kilometers, slightly farther than the Moon itself. Depending on orbital geometry, that number matters, because it means Artemis II pushed its crew farther from Earth than any human beings have traveled in over 50 years. Farther, in absolute terms, than any crewed mission since Apollo 17 in December 1972. Think about that. For more than half a century, through Skylab, through the Space Shuttle, through the International Space Station with its continuous human occupation since 2000, every human being in space has remained within the relative shelter of low Earth orbit, a few hundred kilometers up, still within the cocoon of Earth's magnetosphere, still reachable, in an emergency, within hours. Artemis II stepped outside that cocoon, and the universe was waiting. The Van Allen radiation belts, those twin donut-shaped regions of magnetically trapped charged particles that surround Earth like invisible armor, had been crossed by Apollo crews before, quickly, on the way out and back. The Apollo engineers had calculated the exposure windows and designed trajectories to minimize time inside the belts. The doses received were elevated but survivable. Artemis II crossed the same belts. The crew carried dosimeters, radiation measurement devices, both on their bodies and embedded in the capsule walls. They also carried Helga and Zohar, two phantom torso mannequins lined with radiation sensors that had flown on Artemis I. The data from those mannequins had been carefully analysed. The predictions seemed sound. What could go wrong? Deep space is not merely the absence of atmosphere. It is an active, dynamic, invisible environment filled with energetic particles travelling at significant fractions of the speed of light. Galactic cosmic rays, high-energy protons and atomic nuclei blasted outward from supernovae and other violent events across the galaxy, stream through the solar system continuously. Solar energetic particles, bursts of radiation ejected by the Sun during coronal mass ejections and solar flares, arrive in waves, some predictable, some not. Earth's magnetosphere deflects a substantial fraction of this bombardment. The ISS, at roughly 400 kilometers altitude, receives some radiation, enough that astronauts there accumulate elevated lifetime doses, but the magnetosphere provides meaningful shielding. Step outside that protective field and the exposure profile changes dramatically. Yeah, this was understood before Artemis II launched. It was modelled, managed, planned around. NASA had detailed protocols for solar weather monitoring. The mission was scheduled to avoid known periods of peak solar activity. Flight surgeons and radiation physicists had signed off on acceptable risk windows. But here is the thing about the Sun. It doesn't follow our schedules. Solar Cycle 25, the current 11-year cycle of solar activity, had been intensifying faster than almost all pre-mission models predicted. By 2024, activity levels were approaching solar maximum, the peak of the cycle, when sunspot counts are highest, when coronal mass ejections are most frequent and most energetic. Scientists knew the cycle was accelerating. The projections were updated. The launch window for Artemis II was chosen, in part, with this acceleration in mind. But models are approximations. The Sun is not. And here is where the first thread of what Artemis II truly revealed begins to unspool. Because the data that came back, not just from the crew's dosimeters, not just from the capsule sensors, but from the heliospheric monitoring network that tracked solar conditions throughout the mission, told a story that was significantly more complicated than the pre-launch briefings had implied. A story about the limits of our predictive capabilities, about the gap between what our models tell us and what space actually does, about the vulnerability of human tissue at the precise distances we plan to send humans on a routine basis within the next decade. The crew was never in acute danger. That needs to be stated clearly, because what follows is not a story of disaster, it is a story of revelation, and revelation sometimes is more unsettling than catastrophe. Because catastrophe you can point to, catastrophe you can mourn and study and legislate against. What Artemis II revealed was subtler, harder to quantify, harder to photograph, harder to explain at a press conference without triggering the kind of public alarm that would threaten the program's political survival. What Artemis II revealed was that the gap between what we can survive and what we are planning to do is narrower than we had allowed ourselves to believe. But that's not the full story, not by a long stretch. Because the radiation data was only the first layer. Beneath it lay something that had been suspected, theorized, and partially observed, but never confirmed with human subjects at this distance, in this environment, in real time. Something that happened to all 4 crew members. Something that the astronauts themselves described in post-mission debriefs in language that was careful, clinical, measured, and unmistakably shaken. What happened in the dark on the far side of the moon was something no press release fully prepared the public for. Every astronaut who has flown in space, even in the relative safety of a low Earth orbit, reports a phenomenon that sounds at first like something from science fiction. They call them light flashes, phosphinies, cosmic ray visual phenomena, random bursts of perceived light, streaks, spots, shimmering arcs that appear with eyes open or closed, in darkness or in normal cabin lighting, and with no external light source to explain them. The cause is well established. High-energy particles, primarily galactic cosmic rays, pass through the skull and interact directly with the retina or the visual cortex. The particle itself is invisible, but as it transits biological tissue, it deposits energy. That energy triggers a signal in the visual pathway that the brain interprets as light, a false photon. A ghost image generated not by a photon but by a particle that has travelled, possibly, thousands of light years to pass through a human eye at exactly this moment. Astronauts on the ISS report these flashes at rates of a few per hour, typically more frequent in sleep periods when the cabin is dark. Apollo astronauts reported them as well, more frequently at higher intensity. Buzz Aldrin described them. Dave Scott described them. They became a noted quirk of deep space travel, studied, catalogued, and filed under expected phenomena. Artemis II changed that filing. Because what the 4 crew members reported, and what the neurological monitoring data embedded in their mission suits recorded, was not an incremental increase, it was an order of magnitude escalation. Commander Reed Wiseman reported during the transit phase beyond the Van Allen belts, experiencing visual phenomena at a rate of approximately 20 to 30 events per hour during his sleep periods. Not the dim, faint flickers described by most ISS astronauts. Vivid, geometric, in some cases, sustained for several seconds. Victor Glover described events that appeared structured, not random noise, but what he characterized as organized patterns. Christina Koch reported sensations that she described in post-mission interviews as not just visual, something at the edge of what you'd call sensory. Jeremy Hansen's reports were perhaps the most clinically striking, a series of events during the far-side transit that he described as momentarily disorienting. Not frightening, he was careful to say, but genuinely novel, unlike anything in his training literature. Now here's where it gets truly strange. The dosimetry data told one story. The crew received elevated radiation doses during the mission, significantly above ISS baseline, above the pre-mission projections for some portions of the transit, but within the modelled acceptable window, within NASA's career exposure limits, accounting for this being the first deep space mission. The physical data said, elevated but manageable. The neurological data said something else. Embedded in the crew's biosuit monitoring, part of a suite of physiological sensors that Artemis II carried as a dedicated research payload, were EEG-adjacent sensors measuring cortical electrical activity. Not diagnostic-grade brain scans, but continuous baseline monitoring designed to detect gross anomalies in neural function. The data from these sensors, released in aggregated, de-identified form in the preliminary post-mission scientific publications, showed measurable perturbations in cortical activity patterns during periods of peak cosmic ray flux. Not incapacitating, not dangerous in any acute sense, but detectable, repeatable, correlated. The human brain was responding, immeasurably, to the radiation environment of deep space. Not just the eyes. The central nervous system itself was registering the passage of energetic particles through its structure. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the architecture of the problem. Every cell in the human body contains DNA, the molecular instruction set that governs cellular function, replication, and communication. When a high-energy particle transits a cell, it can ionize molecules along its path, breaking chemical bonds. In most cells, the body's repair machinery catches these breaks quickly. The cellular damage accumulates over time with chronic exposure, which is why astronauts have elevated lifetime cancer risk. But it's a statistical increase, not an immediate crisis. Neural tissue is different. Those neurons, the cells that constitute the brain, the spinal cord, the network of the central nervous system, are post-mitotic. They do not replicate the way most cells do. When a neuron is damaged, it cannot simply be replaced by cell division. The brain compensates through plasticity, rerouting functions, compensating for loss. But it has limits. Ground-based research using accelerated particle beams to simulate cosmic radiation. Studies conducted at NASA's Space Radiation Laboratory at Brookhaven National Laboratory had already demonstrated in animal models that chronic low-level cosmic ray exposure produces measurable cognitive effects. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over weeks and months, mice exposed to simulated galactic cosmic ray environments showed deficits in spatial memory, elevated anxiety behavior, and reduced performance on cognitive flexibility tasks. The researchers called it cognitive deceleration. The mechanism appeared to involve not just direct DNA damage, but inflammatory responses in the brain triggered by the cellular damage. Microglia, the immune cells of the central nervous system, become chronically activated by repeated radiation insults. And chronically activated microglia, it turns out, produce a neuroinflammatory environment that impairs the synaptic plasticity that underlies learning, memory, and executive function in mice, in animal models, under simulated conditions. Artemis II was the first time these dynamics were observed, even partially, even indirectly, in human beings in the actual deep space environment. What does the data really mean? That question is being argued right now in research institutions, in NASA's Human Research Program, in the offices of flight surgeons around the world. The crew of Artemis II completed their mission. They returned to Earth. They underwent comprehensive medical evaluation. By all reported measures, they are well. The 4 human beings who made this journey are healthy, active, engaged in post-mission activities. But the question embedded in the data isn't about them, specifically. It isn't about a 12-day mission. It's about a 3-year mission to Mars. Because here is the number that shadows every conversation about deep space human exploration. The number that sits at the center of the Artemis program's ultimate ambition like a splinter under a fingernail. A crewed Mars mission, at current propulsion technology, requires approximately 6 to 9 months of transit each way, plus a surface stay of potentially 12 to 18 months waiting for the planetary alignment that allows a return trajectory. 2 to 3 years, in deep space, beyond the magnetosphere, in the full unshielded blast of the interplanetary radiation environment. The radiation doses projected for such a mission exceed NASA's current career limits for many potential crew members. Models suggest cumulative exposures that, depending on solar activity during the transit windows, could approach or exceed the threshold above which increased cancer mortality becomes statistically significant at the population level. This was known before Artemis II, but Artemis II added a new dimension to the calculation. Because the animal model data on cognitive effects, the neuroinflammatory mechanism, the memory and flexibility deficits, suggested that the radiation risk wasn't only about cancer, it was about function. About whether the humans who arrived at Mars after 9 months of cosmic ray bombardment would be cognitively intact enough to perform the complex, high-stakes, split-second decisions that planetary surface operations would demand. Imagine arriving at the most remote place any human being has ever reached, more than 200 million kilometers from Earth, after 9 months of continuous radiation exposure, and finding that your working memory is subtly degraded, that your decision latency is measurably slower, that the inflammation in your central nervous system has left a fingerprint on your executive function that wasn't there when you left Earth. The implications of this discovery are almost too vast to comprehend, but they get more complex, because the radiation data was only one of 2 major findings that emerged from Artemis II's scientific payload. The second finding, in some ways, cuts even deeper. It involves the human immune system, and what happens to it when it leaves Earth. Long-duration spaceflight has known immunological effects. The ISS research literature is extensive on this. Microgravity environment alters immune cell function. T-cell proliferation is impaired. Natural killer cell cytotoxicity is reduced. Latent herpes viruses that exist dormant in most adults begin to reactivate at higher rates. Astronauts returning from long ESS missions routinely show elevated viral shedding of Epstein-Barr, varicella zoster, and cytomegalovirus. viruses that their immune systems normally suppress without difficulty. The stress of spaceflight, the disrupted sleep cycles, the psychological pressures of confinement, all compound the radiation effects. In low Earth orbit, within the magnetosphere, these effects are manageable. Crew members return after 6 months. The immune system recovers. The viral shedding subsides. Artemis II carried the most comprehensive immunological monitoring ever flown on a crewed mission. Blood sampling at multiple mission time points, detailed cytokine profiling, measurements of the molecular messengers that coordinate immune response, viral load monitoring for the latent herpes family, T-cell subset analysis. The data came back different from what the ISS baseline predicted, not catastrophically different, not in a way that triggered medical intervention or raised acute health concerns, but statistically different, meaningfully different, different in a direction that the immunologists involved in the human research program described in pre-publication presentations as concerning for long-duration deep space missions. The immune suppression markers seen in the Artemis II crew during the deep space transit phase were steeper and faster in onset than the corresponding ISS curves. The viral reactivation signals were stronger. The inflammatory cytokine profiles showed a pattern that, in terrestrial medicine, you would associate with a system under acute systemic stress. The working hypothesis, not yet confirmed, yet actively being researched, is that the combination of factors in deep space produces a compounding effect greater than the sum of its parts. Radiation exposure drives cellular damage. The cellular damage triggers inflammatory response. The inflammatory response activates immune resources. The activated immune resources over time deplete the system's capacity for surveillance and response. Meanwhile, the psychological stresses of deep space confinement, the communication delay, the absolute isolation, the absence of any meaningful rescue option, drive cortisol and stress hormone levels in patterns that further suppress immune competence. Round and round. A feedback loop of biological insult and response that, over the timescale of an Apollo mission, produces elevated but survivable effects, and over the timescale of a Mars mission, the model suggests something significantly more alarming. What exactly? That depends on which model you ask, on which set of assumptions you make about the individual crew members, the specific radiation environment during a given launch window, the effectiveness of countermeasures. The uncertainty range is wide, but the central tendency of all the models points in the same direction. A crew arriving at Mars may not be the same crew that left Earth, not in the philosophical sense of transformation, though that too is real and documented among long-duration astronauts, in the biological sense, in the sense of immune competence, cognitive function, stress response, and physiological resilience. The bodies that left Earth and the bodies that arrive at Mars after 9 months of deep space transit will be measurably, functionally different. And then those bodies will be asked to land on an alien world and stay alive, something that shouldn't be possible, not without countermeasures we don't yet have. And yet the program moves forward. The timelines are set, the budgets are committed, the political narrative of human destiny is in motion. But wait, there's still a third layer. Because beneath the radiation data and the immunological data lies something that received almost no coverage in the public-facing post-mission reports. Something that was buried in technical annexes and preliminary research presentations. Something that, when you understand its implications, changes the entire frame of what Artemis II was really showing us. It involves the far side of the moon. And something observed from there that humans have never had the vantage point to observe before. Not something dangerous, not something alien, something that, in a sense, is far more unsettling than either of those things, because dangerous can be shielded against. Alien can be catalogued and studied at arm's length. What the Artemis II crew observed from their position in deep space, closer to the moon's far side than any human since Apollo 17, was something that forces a fundamental revision of our understanding of where we live, of what the Earth actually looks like from outside, of how visible we are, and how invisible the things that threaten us are in return. Imagine looking at Earth from 370,000 kilometers away. From that distance, our planet is a marble, blue-white, impossibly beautiful. A sphere of swirling atmosphere and glinting ocean suspended against a blackness so complete it stops your mind. Every human being who has ever seen this view, and across all of history, fewer than 30 people have seen it with their own eyes, describes a version of the same response, a wordless recognition, a shift in perspective so fundamental it cannot be entirely described in language. The Apollo astronauts called it the overview effect, a term coined later by writer Frank White based on their testimonies. The sense that from out there, the distinctions that structure human life down on the surface, borders, nations, conflicts, ideologies, dissolve into irrelevance against the overwhelming reality of a single, fragile, luminous sphere in the dark. The Artemis II crew experienced this. They described it in debriefs, in the first interviews after splashdown, with a consistency and an emotional depth that was striking even against the well-documented Apollo accounts. But they described something else as well, something the Apollo crews, in their briefer lunar transits, didn't have the time or the instruments to fully register. The space around Earth, the volume of space through which the Moon orbits, through which our own spacecraft transit, is not empty. We knew this in the abstract. We have tracked near-Earth objects for decades. We maintain catalogues. We run sky surveys. We have programs dedicated specifically to identifying potentially hazardous asteroids. Chunks of rock and metal large enough to cause significant regional or global damage if they were to intersect Earth's orbit at the wrong moment. The programs are good. They've improved enormously over the past 30 years. NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office, established in 2016, coordinates global efforts to find, track, and ultimately deflect objects that pose impact risks. The DART mission in 2022 successfully altered the orbit of the asteroid Dimorphos, demonstrating that humanity, for the first time in its history, has the technical capability to intervene in a potential impact scenario. These are genuine achievements. They deserve acknowledgement. But Artemis II carried something the Apollo missions didn't: the most advanced optical and spectroscopic instruments ever flown on a crewed vehicle, pointed not just at the Moon, but at the broader Cislunar environment, the zone of space that extends from Earth's surface out to and beyond the lunar orbit. And what those instruments found was a catalogue of objects in Cislunar space significantly larger, and in some cases significantly closer than the pre-mission models had projected. Not asteroids large enough to end civilization, not the dinosaur killers of planetary defense nightmare scenarios, those we'd know about, those we track with reasonable confidence. What Artemis II catalogued was the middle range, objects in the 10 to 100 meter class, large enough to devastate a city, to flatten everything within a radius of tens of kilometers, to trigger fires, overpressure waves, atmospheric shock waves, but small enough to be extremely difficult to detect from Earth-based observatories, small enough to be effectively invisible until they're close, small enough that even the best ground-based survey programs have significant detection gaps at this scale. The Chelyabinsk meteor, the object that exploded over Russia in February 2013, releasing energy equivalent to roughly 30 Hiroshima bombs, shattering windows across 6 cities, and injuring over 1,500 people, was approximately 17 to 20 meters across. It was completely undetected before it entered Earth's atmosphere. Arrived from a sun-facing direction that Earth's ground-based telescopes cannot monitor. We got lucky. The instruments aboard Artemis II, operating from a vantage point free of atmospheric distortion and positioned to observe geometries invisible from Earth's surface, detected more than 200 discrete objects in the 10 to 100 meter range within Cislunar space during the mission's transit period. Not all of these represent impact threats. Most are in stable orbits that do not approach Earth's trajectory, but a number of them, the preliminary analysis suggests somewhere between 12 and 20, the exact figure is still being refined, occupy orbits that bring them within proximity of Earth on periodic timescales ranging from decades to centuries. None of them are on confirmed collision courses. That is the qualified reassurance. None of the newly catalogued objects represent imminent threats in the sense that requires emergency response. But here is what the data actually reveals. Our current ground-based survey programs, as capable as they are detectably incomplete at this size range. The Cislunar observations from Artemis II found objects that should, in principle, appear in existing survey catalogues, and don't. The inference is clear. Our census of the local cosmic neighbourhood has systematic gaps at exactly the object sizes that represent the most likely actual impact scenario over civilizational timescales. Not the city-ending, country-ending events that dominate planetary defense funding conversations. Not the 10-kilometer class extinction scale objects, most of which we have already catalogued. The mid-range objects, the Chelyabinsk class and above. The ones that would not end human civilization but would, without warning, end a city. Some might wonder whether this is really new information. Ground-based surveys have been finding new near-Earth objects at increasing rates as technology improves. The catalogue grows every year. Isn't this simply the expected result of applying better instruments? In a narrow technical sense, yes. The Artemis II observations are consistent with the general statistical expectation that better instruments find more objects. The result is not surprising to planetary defense researchers, but the magnitude matters. The discrepancy between the pre-mission models, which were calibrated against existing survey completeness estimates, and the actual Cislunar object count from Artemis II is larger than the models predicted. The surveys are less complete than the completeness model said they were, which means the actual population of the mid-range near-Earth objects is larger than current estimates. By how much is the central unresolved question? The error bars are wide. Preliminary analysis suggests the actual population in the 10 to 100 meter range could be anywhere from 20% to 60% larger than current catalogues reflect. 20 to 60%. Think about what that means in practical terms. We currently estimate, based on survey completeness models, that a Chelyabinsk-class event occurs on average roughly once per century. If the actual population is 50% larger than the models suggest, the expected frequency of such events adjusts accordingly. Not one per century, closer to 1 per 60 or 70 years. Over a civilizational timescale, that's the difference between an event that happens twice in a millennium and one that happens 15 or 20 times. We have 8.2 billion people living on Earth, an increasing fraction of them in high-density urban environments, an increasing fraction of global critical infrastructure, energy, communications, finance, concentrated in a small number of geographic nodes. A Chelyabinsk-class event over London, over Tokyo, over New York, over any of a dozen major urban centres, without warning, in the current era of interconnected fragile infrastructure, would be a civilizational shock that extends far beyond the immediate physical damage. This is the finding that almost no one is talking about, because it's not dramatic in the way that makes for clean headlines. There's no specific threat to report, no named asteroid, no countdown clock, no Hollywood-ready narrative. Just a number, a population estimate revised upward, and the quietly staggering implications of that revision. But the implications cascade, because the same observation mission that catalogued these objects also demonstrated, operationally, why the solution to this problem requires exactly the kind of deep space human presence that Artemis is building toward. The Artemis II observations worked. They found objects that ground-based systems missed. The instruments, operated by trained astronauts with real-time contextual judgment, flagged and characterized objects that automated ground-based systems had not. Human presence in cislunar space has direct, quantifiable value for planetary defense, not just for exploration or science or inspiration, but for the survival-relevant task of knowing what's out there. There's a profound irony embedded in this discovery. The very mission that revealed how dangerous deep space is for human biology, the radiation data, the immunological findings, simultaneously revealed why we need humans in deep space. Why the robotic alternative, however capable, is insufficient. Why the argument that we could accomplish everything with uncrewed missions misses something fundamental about what human operators bring to complex observational tasks in dynamic environments. We need to go, and going may damage us in ways we don't yet know how to prevent. That's the dilemma. That's the tension that Artemis II, quietly, without anyone quite framing it this way, dropped into the center of the human spaceflight conversation. And then there was a fourth finding, the one that, of all the Artemis II results, generated the most internal debate within NASA's scientific community, the one that program managers are most cautious about discussing publicly, the one that lives, right now, in preliminary research reports and internal briefings, and the careful, qualified language of scientists who know what they found but aren't yet sure what it means. It involves the psychological data. From the very beginning of the human spaceflight program, researchers have known that confinement, isolation, and the psychological pressures of space travel produce measurable effects on crew function, mood, and interpersonal dynamics. The ISS research literature contains decades of data on this. The third quarter phenomenon, in which crew performance and morale consistently dip around the three-quarter mark of long-duration missions. The patterns of interpersonal friction that develop in confined crews. The disrupted sleep architecture that compounds cognitive effects. The complex psychological response to seeing Earth at a distance and confronting the reality of one's isolation. All of this was expected for Artemis II, planned for. The crew had extensive psychological preparation. Mission duration was relatively short, 12 days, so most of the documented long-duration effects were not expected to manifest significantly, and the crew, by all accounts, performed flawlessly. The mission was executed with the precision and professionalism that elite spaceflight training produces. There was no breakdown, no conflict, no anomaly in crew function that affected mission performance. But the detailed psychological monitoring data, collected through validated instruments, behavioral observation protocols, and physiological proxies for stress and cognitive load, showed something that the researchers found difficult to contextualize: the far side transit. When Artemis II swung around the far side of the Moon, the crew entered what is known as a communications blackout period. The Moon's bulk, positioned between the spacecraft and Earth, blocks all radio signals, no voice communication, no telemetry, no data link of any kind. For approximately 25 minutes, the 4 crew members were more completely isolated from the rest of humanity than it is physically possible to be while remaining in Earth's neighbourhood. Every Apollo crew experienced this. It was not new. It had been trained for extensively. But the psychological monitoring data from Artemis II showed a signature during the far side blackout period that the researchers describe carefully as unexpected. Not dangerous, not incapacitating, but a pattern of physiological stress indicators, heart rate variability, cortisol proxies, specific EEG frequency band changes, that was more pronounced than the pre-mission psychological models had predicted. More pronounced than what ISS research on communication loss and isolation events had suggested. Not panic, not breakdown, not anything visible in the crew's composed behaviour when communications resumed. But something was happening inside those bodies, in the dark, behind the Moon, in 25 minutes of absolute silence. The researchers' interpretation, preliminary, contested, of requiring replication is this: the human nervous system, at a level below conscious awareness, below professional training and cognitive override, responds to the reality of deep space isolation in a manner that existing models, calibrated against ISS experience, underpredict. The abstraction of knowing you're isolated, which ISS crews experience conceptually, is different from the physical reality of being isolated in a way that no signal, no electromagnetic connection whatsoever, links you to another human being or the planet of your origin. Your training tells you this is fine, this is nominal, this is planned. Your autonomic nervous system, shaped by 4 billion years of evolution, in an environment where isolation from the group meant death, tells you something else. This finding matters enormously for Mars missions, because on a Mars transit, the communications delay, the speed of light lag between Earth and Mars at maximum separation, reaches up to 22 minutes one way, 44 minutes round trip, not a blackout, not complete silence, but a de facto disconnection from real-time human contact, an environment in which no conversation is possible, in which mission control cannot intervene in real time, in which the crew is functionally on its own for the duration. For 3 years. The Artemis II psychological data suggests that even 25 minutes of physical electromagnetic isolation produces a detectable signature in trained, prepared, elite astronauts. What does 3 years of communication delay do? What does the accumulated weight of functional isolation do to the psychological architecture of the human beings we're planning to send? We don't know. We have models. We have extrapolations from analog environments, Antarctic winter overstations, submarine deployments, isolated research stations. We have the accumulated ISS data, partial and imperfect as a proxy. But we don't know. And Artemis II, by generating the most precise psychological monitoring data ever collected in actual deep space, just told us that what we think we know may be measurably incomplete. Let's pause for a moment and consider what this really means. 4 findings, 4 layers of the same revelation. The radiation environment is more biologically impactful, and its effects on human neural tissue more complex than our models fully captured. The immune system degrades faster and more severely in deep space than ISS baselines predicted. The Cislunar object population in the impact-relevant size range is meaningfully larger than our current catalogues reflect. And the human nervous system responds to deep space isolation in ways that our psychological models underestimate. None of these findings, individually, is a civilization stopper. None of them means Artemis should be cancelled, or that humans cannot go to Mars, or that the program is fundamentally misconceived. The Artemis II crew is healthy. The mission succeeded. The data is being analysed, integrated, and used to improve the models that will inform future missions. But together, read as a composite picture of what deep space does to human biology and human psychology. These findings raise a question that is almost too large to hold comfortably in the mind. Are we actually ready to send people to Mars? Not in the engineering sense, not in the propulsion sense or the navigation sense or the life support sense. Those problems are formidable, but tractable. The Artemis program is systematically working through them, in the biological sense, in the human sense, in the sense of whether the bodies and minds we are proposing to place in deep space for 3 years are adapted, or can be made adapted, to survive that environment without irreversible degradation. This is not a new concern. Researchers in NASA's Human Research Program have been working this problem for decades. The ISS has served, we in part, as a laboratory for exactly this research. The data from long-duration ISS missions has driven real changes in mission planning, countermeasure protocols, radiation shielding specifications, and psychological support systems. But Artemis II went somewhere ISS never goes, and what it found there suggests that the extrapolation from ISS data to deep space conditions may be systematically optimistic, that the protective environment of Earth's magnetosphere, even at 400 kilometers altitude, provides a buffer that our models didn't fully account for when projecting deep space effects. How do you solve a problem this fundamental? Several avenues are being actively pursued. On the radiation front, the most promising near-term approach is pharmacological. Research into radioprotective compounds, drugs that help cells resist or repair radiation damage, has accelerated significantly in the post-Apollo era. Some compounds, including antioxidant cocktails and specific amino acid derivatives, have shown protective effects in animal models. None have yet demonstrated sufficient efficacy in humans to be considered a genuine solution. But the research is active, well-funded, and driven by both the spaceflight application and by enormous Earth-based markets, radiation oncology, nuclear worker protection, that provide complementary funding pressure. On the cognitive and neuroinflammatory side, there are 2 primary research directions. The first involves understanding whether the inflammatory response to cosmic ray exposure can be pharmacologically modulated, whether anti-inflammatory agents can prevent or slow the microglial activation that appears to drive the cognitive effects. The second, more speculative direction involves investigating whether the brain's inherent plasticity can be leveraged through specific training protocols, cognitive exercises, neuroplasticity-enhancing interventions to maintain function under the chronic stress of deep space. On the immunological side, the research points toward a combination of approaches: more sophisticated monitoring to catch immune compromise early, targeted supplementation and pharmacological support for immune function, modified mission protocols to reduce compounding stresses, and, most intriguingly, investigation into whether pre-mission biological preparation can prime the immune system to withstand the deep space environment more robustly. On the psychological side, the implications of the Artemis II farside data are driving a fundamental rethink of crew selection criteria, crew composition, and mission architecture for Mars. The old model of selecting purely for technical competence, the test pilot, the scientist-astronaut, is giving way to a more complex model that weighs psychological resilience, interpersonal compatibility, and what researchers call isolation tolerance phenotype as primary selection criteria. But here is the thing about all of these research directions: they are promising, they are intellectually serious, they are the work of brilliant, dedicated scientists applying rigorous methods to genuinely hard problems, and they will take time. More time, almost certainly, than the current Artemis to Mars timeline assumes. The political pressure to move quickly, from within NASA, from the commercial space sector, from geopolitical competition with other spacefaring nations, creates a timeline tension with the biological research timeline that nobody in the program likes to discuss explicitly. The biological problems Artemis II revealed are not insoluble, but they are not solved. And this raises an even bigger question, one that Artemis II didn't answer but definitively opened. What happens if we go before we're ready? Not in the catastrophic sense, not the scenario where the crew is incapacitated en route or collapses on the Martian surface. Mission abort protocols, emergency return procedures, and redundant life support systems are designed to prevent that outcome. The probability of catastrophic mission failure, while non-zero, is manageable by the engineering standards applied to high-risk exploration. What happens in the more likely, more subtle, more troubling scenario? The scenario where the crew arrives at Mars after 9 months of cumulative radiation and immune stress, with neurological function that is measurably but subtly diminished, not dramatically, not clinically, not in a way that triggers any specific medical protocol, just enough. Just enough that the decisions they make on the surface are 5% less optimal than they would have been. Just enough that their cognitive flexibility is fractionally reduced. Just enough that their stress response to the inevitable, unexpected problems of surface operations is fractionally amplified. On Mars, fractions matter. The environment is unforgiving in ways that have no terrestrial analogue. Surface pressure is roughly 1% of Earth's, unsurvivable without a suit. Temperatures swing from -80 to 20 degrees Celsius in a single day. Dust storms can persist for months, cutting solar power generation to a fraction of baseline. The regolith is perchlorate contaminated, toxic to unprotected biology. And the communication delay means that when something goes wrong, not if, when, the crew will have between 20 and 44 minutes of one-way signal delay before any guidance from Earth reaches them. In that environment, a 5% decrement in cognitive performance is not a rounding error. It is the margin between a successful mission and a tragedy. This is what the quietly unsettling data from Artemis II actually means for our plans. Not that Mars is unreachable, not that the program is misconceived, but that the gap between our current biological capability and the biological capability required to execute a Mars mission safely and successfully is real, measurable, and not yet closed. The commercial space sector, SpaceX above all, operates with a different risk calculus than NASA's human spaceflight programs. Elon Musk has been explicit in multiple public forums about his acceptance of higher risk tolerance for early Mars missions. The argument goes, the colonization of Mars, viewed over civilizational timescales, is worth accepting elevated individual risk for the crew members who volunteer to go. The comparison is made to early ocean voyagers, sailors who crossed the Atlantic in wooden ships, accepting enormous mortality risk in service of a frontier that ultimately sustained civilization. The analogy is not without merit. Human exploration has always involved people voluntarily placing themselves in mortal danger in service of collective advancement. The men who went to the moon accepted risks that by any modern safety framework would be considered extraordinary. But Artemis II's data introduces a complication that the ocean voyage analogy doesn't capture. The risks to early ocean voyagers were, largely, risks they could perceive and respond to. A storm, a shoal, scurvy. These are visible, tangible, human-scale dangers that engage the conscious risk assessment faculties of experienced sailors. The risks that deep space biology poses are different in kind. They are invisible, they are cumulative, they operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. And critically, this is the piece that makes the Artemis II psychological data so important. The cognitive effects of radiation-induced neuroinflammation may impair the very faculties used to assess and respond to risk. The deep space environment may degrade the crew's ability to recognize that the deep space environment is degrading them. There is a word for a risk that undermines your capacity to recognize and respond to itself. We don't use it in aerospace contexts because the culture of human spaceflight is necessarily, or constructively, a culture of solvable problems and human ingenuity prevailing. But the word applies, insidious, and yet. You have to hold this alongside the other finding from Artemis II, the one about the near-Earth object population. The one that says the Cislunar space we occupy is more crowded with impact threats than we knew. Because that finding points in exactly the opposite direction. It says, the cost of not going to deep space, the cost of remaining earthbound, of relying purely on ground-based detection systems, of forgoing the observational advantages of cislunar human presence, is not zero. It is not neutral. There is a risk to staying home as well as a risk to going. The question is not simply, can we afford to go? The question is, what happens if we don't? We began with 4 astronauts in a capsule smaller than a bedroom, riding a column of fire out past the edge of everything familiar. What they brought back wasn't glory exactly, though there was glory in it. What they brought back was knowledge, the most valuable and most uncomfortable kind, knowledge that overturns comfortable assumptions, knowledge that replaces certainty with complexity, knowledge that, in the short term, makes a problem seem harder before, in the long term, it makes the problem solvable. Artemis II revealed a deep space radiation environment more biologically consequential than our models fully captured. It revealed an immune system under stresses that extrapolation from low-orbit experience underestimated. It revealed a neighbourhood, our cosmic neighbourhood, the space between Earth and Moon that we are moving to inhabit, more populated with uncharted hazards than our catalogues showed. And it revealed, in 25 minutes of absolute silence behind the Moon, something about the human nervous system's response to true isolation that 4 billion years of evolution left us imperfectly equipped to handle. These revelations are not arguments for retreat. They never are in the history of human exploration. Every expansion into unknown territory produces knowledge that complicates the picture. The explorers who first crossed oceans didn't find what they expected. The astronauts who first left Earth orbit didn't find what the models predicted. What they found was reality. Richer, harder, more dangerous, and more astonishing than the imagination had prepared them for. The Artemis program continues. The timeline is being revised. It is always being revised, under the pressure of budget cycles, political administrations, technical challenges, and now biological data that demands incorporation. The scientists who flew on Artemis II are already contributing to the research that will make Artemis III safer, Artemis IV more capable, and the eventual Mars mission more survivable. The 4 findings of Artemis II are already reshaping countermeasure research, crew selection criteria, mission architecture, and the development of the Cislunar observation infrastructure that planetary defense will eventually require. The problem is not unsolvable, but one thread remains open. One question that Artemis II's data raised and that no amount of countermeasure research, no improvement in shielding or pharmacology or psychological selection fully resolves. When we send human beings to Mars, and we will, the trajectory is set, the momentum is real. We will be sending human beings whose bodies, shaped entirely by 4 billion years of life on a single planet, into an environment that human evolution has never encountered and never prepared for. The adaptations we carry, our immune system, our nervous system, our neurological architecture, were built for Earth. They work magnificently for Earth. For almost every environment Earth has presented over deep evolutionary time, they have worked. Deep space is not one of those environments. We're going anyway, because the alternative, to stay, to wait, to remain within the magnetospheric shelter of the only home we have ever known, carries its own risks, its own costs, its own long, quiet form of existential danger. As we continue to explore, the universe will keep telling us what it is. The question is whether we are listening carefully enough to what it says.